Okay, so you guys, before I bring on my guest for today, I got to tell you this crazy story. This is sort of bananas. So I'm agnostic about whether God planned out the church liturgical calendar at the foundation of creation, like whether he sort of intended for us to have the festivals and the rituals that we have now in the Christian church exactly as they are. But I am firmly convinced that because God knows we have this sort of yearly ritual of acknowledging Christ's life and death and resurrection, he uses it to communicate with us about his nature. And so during Lent, which is just finished, the period of penitential suffering, we often have things. If you start to look around, you will notice that there are weirdly providential things that happen that try you, that cause you some amount of suffering. And for me, like, I live this charmed life. They're relatively minor. I don't mean to portray myself as like another Jesus in the desert, suffering and starving or whatever. It's not that, but it does weirdly tend to cohere and conform. And then when Easter happens, the mood kind of changes, the vibes shift. And I do believe in a certain liturgical providence to this. So last week, I was supposed to record my interview with my guest today, John Daniel Davidson, senior editor at the Federalist, who's written this new book, Pagan America. I'm really excited about it. I've, got the hard copy, I've been reading in it and just like making notes and getting ready to talk, because he's talking about all sorts of stuff that we talk about on this show all the time, as you will soon see. But John, last minute, things come up, book tours are crazy, he has to reschedule. At the same time as I'm learning this, I discover on that very day, which is Good Friday, the lowest point of the liturgical calendar, the day when we remember the crucifixion, I discover that my car has been stolen. And I told you guys about this on the episode this week, that it's vanished and I had to call insurance. And so it actually was weirdly convenient that John had to reschedule, because I called insurance and I called the cops and all this stuff. But it was a very sort of Good Friday, just gloomy day. It was like, well, my car's been stolen. I might have to come up with some new podcast to do. And it was just a very, I think I recorded a podcast about Good Friday on that day, because it really was like liturgical providence, kind of getting the point across and putting me in the mood, let's say. So now we are in the sort of Easter liturgical season. We had Easter Sunday and we're 1 week out from that. And for this very day, John has rescheduled to record. And so we're on getting ready to record. And it's the time of renewal, the time of redemption, the time of the finding of lost things. And I kid you not, about a half hour before I'm supposed to record, my insurance calls me to say that the cops have found my car. It's an Easter miracle. And it's like all things that went wrong on that day are now being made right. And I just have to tell you, like, these things happen too often to feel like they are coincidence. So do with that what you will, but I bring to you now a redemptive interview with John Daniel Davidson, author of Pagan America. Really interesting guy with a really fascinating argument, in some ways a sobering argument about the extent of post-Christian decline in the West, but also I think a lot of insight and hope about what to do about it. These are subjects that we've talked about extensively on the show. John has helped me to think through some of them with his book, which you should go check out. I will drop the link, but let's waste no more time in talking to the man himself, John Daniel Davidson. Right. Well, you've heard of African Americans. You've heard of Asian Americans. You might even have heard of unhoused Americans. But, dear listeners, have you heard of pagan Americans? Turns out they're all around you already. That's the argument of my guest's new book. This is John Daniel Davidson, senior editor at the Federalist. And his book is called Pagan America, The Decline of Christianity and the Dark Age to come. I suspect this is a subject that will interest a lot of young heretics listeners. It turns out, John, you and I are thinking about some similar things. But could you start off, please, just by telling us a little bit about what you mean when you say that America is already essentially a pagan country? What does the word pagan mean there, and
Sure.
why are we it?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for having me on here, Spencer, to talk about this. Um, by pagan, I mean the opposite of Christian. The inversion of the Christian ethos and worldview is the pagan ethos and worldview, where Christianity posits transcendent moral truths about human nature and the created order and God, and how we should rightly order society. The pagan world says nothing is true, everything is permitted. And that is really the kernel of the idea behind pagan America, that there is only one alternative to Christianity and to a society that is ordered around Christian principles and ideals and teachings, and that is a pagan society. And the future of America isn't this secular liberal utopia. It is a pagan society that operates according to the principles that pagan societies have always operated on, and that is force and coercion, and might makes right.
So there's something really interesting, I think, implied in what you just said, which is that paganism isn't just not Christianity. It's not simply the absence of Christian ideals, but it's the opposite of Christianity, or the negation of
Yes.
Christian ideals, to invoke a frequent concept that people attach to the devil, right? The devil is the great
Yes.
negator or the inverter. And it strikes me that this is one, might be one way in which post-Christian paganism differs from pre-Christian paganism. There's at least the possibility that before Christianity comes along, the people that aren't doing Christianity are just doing human life, because there is no
Mm-hmm.
Christianity to negate. But once you've had the advent of Christ and the creation of Christendom, foundation of America, you sort of can't just be neutral. You have to, in some sense, be rejecting, or in your case, I think you're arguing reverting, going backwards. Um, is there a way in which post-Christian societies are different, maybe even worse than pre-Christian societies?
Well, I think we're going to find out, because because
That's a
we're in
sunny outlook. Yeah.
we're in a post-Christian society, and that's part of the claim of the book too, is to make the case that we are not, and have not been for some time, like a Christian civilization. We've entered a post-Christian era that we're kind of coming fully into now, and the ways in which we are post-Christian are starting to come into view in increasingly, I think, obvious ways. And one of the purposes of the book is to kind of explain that and show that, and trace a line back, and connect it with pre-Christian paganism. Now, I will say that prior to Christianity, you didn't have Christ, you didn't have a Christian society, but you did have Judaism. And Judaism, as a Christian, I would say that there's a continuity between Judaism and Christianity, and the Christianity is in some ways an extension and a completion of Judeo Judaism, not Judeo-Christian religion,
Mm.
but to the point of the phrase, the Israelites were, in their cosmology, in their religion, correcting the pagan myths that were sort of common to all ancient Near Eastern civilizations. They had a common sort of cosmological vision of the world and the powers that governed the world, right?
Mm.
And the Jews didn't necessarily reject that, but they corrected it. They
Mm.
at key moments they sort of changed, had a different interpretation, a different account that they proposed for the universe. So instead of Baal overthrowing his father, right, and there being this rebellion in heaven, uh,
Mm.
the rebellion failed, right? And the one true God, Yahweh, was victorious, right? So
Comparing the
so
book of
the
Genesis to the Enuma Elish is kind of another version of
yeah,
that, right?
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So the point here is that there's always been a kind of like contest, right,
Mhm.
between the pagan order and the let's call it the Judeo-Christian order or cosmological view of reality and the created world and humanity. And that's always been there. And paganism has kind of always been there too. Christianity, yes, defeated the pagan empires and defeated paganism, but it didn't eradicate it. And it's there, kind of simmering under the surface. And what we're seeing now, as we enter this modern, postmodern, post-Christian era, is paganism is coming back. It's resurfacing, and it's going to resurface in new forms, under new names. Um, the people who I would argue today are pagans are not going to necessarily think of themselves as pagans or call themselves pagans. They're not going to build altars to Zeus and Apollo in Times Square, but they will and are living according to the pagan ethos, and they have a fundamentally pagan worldview, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, you do talk in the book about some people who call themselves pagans explicitly,
Right, right,
the Wiccans, the witch. But you're absolutely right that those are not the only people who are sort of recognizably pagan. And
right,
maybe we don't call Ishtar or Inanna by her name, but we do put up statues to abortion in the
right,
middle of New York. So the
right.
question is, right, how different really is that? And it strikes me as you're talking, I've never really quite thought of it this way, but one of the major conceptual innovations that Judaism, in some sense, bequeaths to the world is this concept of the Gentiles, as we now call it, which is the Goyim, right? That everybody else besides the Jews, basically, are
Right.
doing is doing the same thing. They didn't think of themselves that way. They would have vociferously denied any identity between, Marduk and Ashur, who were,
Hmm.
supposed to be at war with each other.
Right.
But the scripture and the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible says, no, 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 these are all the same. It's all the same noise. So
Yes.
you're right. The Christian sort of ethos mindset picks that up. And this leads me to another question about our paganism, about modern paganism. Do you think that since paganism just is kind of everything besides revealed religion, by almost by definition, um, is it more natural to people? Does it come more easily to believe, if I burn sage, the bad spirits will go away? Or, in your chapter on science and magic, that there's some power or force or energy floating through the world? I mean, are Christians fighting, in some sense, an uphill battle by trying to convince people that this is not just the obvious way that the world works?
Yeah, I think so, and I think that's a good insight and observation. You might say that paganism is native to humanity,
Mhm.
right? Um, I think Christianity is too, right? Because as human beings, we have reason, right? And reason and faith are not in conflict; they complement one another. And so both of these things are native to human nature and to our common humanity, right? And that's why they're the two kind of permanent things that are always at war with each other, that are always being contested. These two ways of seeing the world and two ways of being. Um, one of the things about paganism, I think, as Christians, we're accustomed to kind of understanding the world as cohering, right? That the world kind of makes sense, and even the way we organize our society,
Mm.
and even American society, that we have checks and balances, and we have individual rights, and then there are certain principles that flow from that, and it makes sense, right? The pagan mindset does not cohere in the same way, because it's not about reason and order. It's not about um, it's positing this other side of humanity, which is will and desire
Mm.
and compulsion and um, you know you don't have to be logical, and you don't have to have a system of thought cohere. And that's why I think you see, as we enter this post-Christian era, you're seeing the disfigurement of reason in a lot of different ways in our society. You know, having a society, like having something that, like, the whole idea of the scientific method in many ways is a Christian idea, right? That flows from a prior understanding of man's reason. But uh, but in the pagan, like, ethos and the pagan mindset, you don't necessarily have that. And so we're starting to see, examples of this, where out of one side of our mouth we talk about following the science, and we talk about data, being driven by data and facts, but on the other hand, we're also sort of like positing this very unscientific, unreasonable um, notions of, like, identity and being able to create our own realities, and that a man can become a woman and a woman can become a man, and the only thing that makes an unborn child a human being is the desire of the mother to keep it. Things like that are not based in science at all.
Mm.
They have nothing to do with science or reason. They have to do with will and power.
Mm. I'm trying not to interrupt you too much, but
No, go
those that
ahead.
are watching on YouTube can see me sort of vibing along. You're talking about a lot of things that have preoccupied me on this show, and that's true of the book as well, which everybody should check out. Yeah, I mentioned earlier the comparison between the Enuma Elish and Genesis 1. And something I've said before, I think, on the show is people don't realize Genesis 1 is revisionist history, that it
Right.
contradicts, in some sense, the governing, what you would have believed as a sort of
Yes.
upstanding person wandering around. It would have been totally bananas to posit, no sort of decent average citizen would posit that there's like one God. And you take the, moment in Genesis 1 where God speaks creation into existence with an obvious design and a kind of cognitive
Mm-hmm.
order in place. And you compare that with any other story in which there are two or more originary principles, right? Apsu and Tiamat, let's say, or Gaia and Uranus, that the fundamental difference between saying, okay, there's one coherent plan versus there's actually, a multitude of
Right.
competing options. This is pointing this sort of stuff out is what got Socrates killed, right? And
Yep.
and this, I mean, there is no science without a unitary idea of the cosmos. And you're
Yes.
absolutely right that now that's starting to fall apart. Um, I would like to get into talking with you a little bit more actually about science and magic. So this is probably a
Okay.
good segue into that. So you have this chapter, The Rise of the Materialist Magician. And there's a lot of juicy stuff in here, some of it based on my personal favorite 20th century intellectual, C.S. Lewis, and this idea that, the devils in Screwtape want us to basically miss the connection between these two things so that they can finally persuade us to believe in both at once, that we can
Yes.
imagine ourselves to be scientific while actually performing conjuring acts. And this is like, right in line with what this show has been about for a while. But there is a premise in this book and in this whole argument that you really do kind of go for, and in a way that maybe surprised me a little bit, because I agree with you, but I also find this like difficult to kind of a difficult pill to get people to swallow, which is that, like, there are demons with,
Mm-hmm.
if not, identities of the kind that we might ascribe to individuals or even to God,
Yeah.
intentions,
Yeah.
tendencies, and um, is that something that you think uh, people are maybe more likely to be more receptive to now that we're more superstitious, or or is this a hard kind of hurdle to get over?
Yeah. No, that's a good point. And it's hard to write a book called Pagan America without kind of dealing with the question of, like, what are we talking about? Like, what are the pagan gods? Are they just figments of our imaginations, or are they created beings, with intelligence and will of their own? Are they, and what do we call them? You know, it might scare people to call them demons, but you know, the AI Silicon Valley crowd might call them discarnate intelligences or
Mm.
multidimensional beings, right?
Mm.
So whatever you call them, they you know, to go back to this thing about the ancient Israelites, they're not gods; they're created beings, right?
Mm.
And in the past they have been worshipped as gods, um, but the Christian the Christian worldview would say that they're created beings that were cast out from heaven. So they're here now, and they've always been here, and they're still here. And the point about screw tape, you know, I quoted that passage from C.S. Lewis on purpose, and I took his phrase as the title of that chapter because it so well encapsulates this idea that in the modern era, in the age of materialism, the demons worked very hard to keep themselves hidden. You right, you know, because
Mm.
if they
Yeah.
remain hidden, uh, I'm not going to quote it directly, but I'm going to paraphrase. He said, you know, if we reveal ourselves, then we can make no skeptics, right? And
Mm. Yeah. Yeah.
and we want people to be skeptics because we want their mind to be closed to belief in the enemy, which by enemy he of course means God, and that is the great advantage of remaining hidden, but that he's looking forward to a day where they can create this new man that combines elements of psychoanalysis and other things, to basically believe in spiritual forces without naming them and without worshiping them. And then, if we can create the materialist magician, this amalgam of the materialist skeptic and the superstitious pagan, then the end of the war will be in sight. And I think that's happening now. I think people are more superstitious now. The idea that we were all going to be materialist, secular skeptics has not like borne itself out. We're not, and
Yeah.
you see all these different expressions. You know, I mean, yes, I said earlier we're not going to see temples to Zeus and Apollo in Times Square, but we are seeing an explosion in new forms of like what I call moral therapeutic witchcraft, right? Um,
Mm-hmm.
these pagan kind of practices, but in a new and modern context, using some different vocabulary to describe what they're doing. But it absolutely is the emergence of Lewis's materialist magician right now.
Hmm. Yeah, it's. I had Mary Harrington on a while
Mm,
back, and we were talking about people's sudden openness to demons and demonology. And she said, basically, you know, she's, I by no means the sort of person that you would instantly think, you know, well, she, of course, she believes in demons, right? She's not the sort of person that you would expect to find talking about this. But she
right.
said, you know, you can call it an egregoric manifestation of the
Hmm.
collective unconscious, or you can just say demons, and one of them is faster and gets across basically everything that you mean at a certain point.
Yes.
These disembodied intelligences. You also cite Lewis's, I think, greatest work of fiction, That Hideous Strength. And
Yes.
you say, you know, in that, the NICE, the kind of materialist magicians, use the term macrobes because they're, you
Yeah.
know, microbes, and so they're macrobes. And it's a perfect parody of the way that we use this supposedly depersonalized language to blind ourselves to what we're actually talking about, which
Totally.
is basically
Totally.
demons, right? Um, and on this point, let me read to you from your own book a little bit about the Satanic Temple, because this really put me in mind of something that happened after the Dobbs decision came down. Actually, you write, the IRS was onto something, and this is in categorizing the Satanic Temple as a church. Is the Satanic Temple's materialist progressive version of Satanism is indeed a form of religion, or at least a supranational expression of religious faith. You might even call it neo pagan humanism. According to the group's website, to embrace the name Satan is to embrace rational inquiry removed from supernaturalism and archaic tradition based superstitions. Yeah. So after Dobbs came down and everybody who was of this cast of mind was freaking out about not getting to kill babies, there was a thread on Reddit about how all you people that are freaked out, you should all come to the Satanic Temple because
Hmm.
we, you know, believe in abortion rights.
Hmm.
And somebody said on the thread, you know, I don't really want to align myself with Satan, even though
Right.
I believe in abortion rights. And the moderator, I think it was, dropped in and said, no, 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 don't worry. It doesn't have anything to do with actual Satan. It's just about rationalism
Yeah.
and modern liberal values. I thought, au contraire, my friend, this is a distinction without a difference, right? You mentioned Richard Dawkins. In researching my own book, I had a sort of occasion to go back to the selfish gene and think about really the peak of the new atheist movement, which had Dawkins in it and Hitchens and a bunch of others. I mean, Hitchens was the best of them, and
Right.
tragically he died. But you know, the the funny thing about Dawkins was how quickly he had gone out of date. It was like they
Yeah.
basically raised their fingers for a second. They're like, well, I'll be rationalist. And then they were instantly stampeded by people being like, great, we'll turn rationalism into a religion. And now Dawkins is being like, hey, cultural Christianity,
Yeah.
which is also like 20 years behind the times. I mean, Marcello Pero was writing about that in 2008. The guy is just like perennially on the back foot and doesn't realize it because
Yeah.
he doesn't see religion. So all this simply to say, um, there's obviously a religious streak in the heart of man
Hmm.
that has colonized every attempt at, disenchanting the world.
Yes.
Do you do you feel that there is a kind of perverse room for hope in this? That I mean, can God work better in some sense with somebody that believes in any power than somebody that is stubbornly insisting on no power or no theology? Is there some sort of room for evangelism, I guess, in the fact that people are obviously hungry for the spiritual?
Yeah. I absolutely think there is. And uh, you know, I say at the end of the book, it's not a counsel of despair, right? This
Mm-hmm.
this argument that we're entering a pagan era, a post-Christian era, and part of it is that there is an opening, maybe a greater opening than there was in the kind of the brief. We had this brief period, maybe 100 years of like, materialist, rationalist, worldview where like, just cold atheism, and that was going to be the future. It didn't last. It was,
Mm-hmm.
as you said, it was over almost as it began. Um, a line from the writer Paul Kingsnorth comes to mind, and I think I may quote it in the book at some point. But he said, "There's a throne at the heart of every culture, and something will sit on it." Right. And or to quote Bob Dylan, "You got to serve somebody,"
Yeah, just a
and
matter
I
who.
think like we were, Dawkins and Hitchens and the others were wrong to think that like the future would be atheist. Like that's just not human nature, and it's also not like that's not real. It's not reality. The reality is there are powers and principalities in the world. God is real, and the angels are real, and the devil is real. and
Yeah.
and for most of human history, everyone has agreed on that anyway. They disagreed maybe over like who were the most powerful gods, or was there one almighty God, or were there several almighty gods? But the existence of them was never called into question until just sort of the modern era, and now we're passing out of it. And I think in the passing out of it, there is an opportunity then to proclaim the gospel again and to proclaim the truth of the one true God, and to make the claim that the Jews first made and that the Christians continue, that our God and Jesus Christ is the most high God, and all these other beings, whatever you want to call them, discarnate intelligences, are created. They're created, uh, and uh, and many of them are malign and wish us harm, and are not to be engaged with, and will lead you astray and lie to you and destroy you if they can. And so I do think that is one reason for hope, that there may be a kind of receptiveness to the gospel that wasn't there even a generation or two ago.
Yeah, no, I'm inclined to agree. I'm a big I'm an average hope enjoyer, as I like to say on this podcast, because I just think everybody's always asking, are you a pessimist? Are you an optimist? And both of those are predictions about the future, which I feel singularly unqualified to make. But
Right,
hope,
right,
as we know, right, is a Christian virtue.
right.
And so we want to look for places where we can hope with tough realism, which is what you're
Yes.
kind of talking about, right? Um, so let me ask you a little bit more about that. You conclude the book with both tough realism of the kind that I think you've already introduced to our listeners, but also with some hope, including you talk about the Boniface option, which is in contradistinction to the Benedict option. That's Rod Dreher's famous counsel. He too, like you, has a pretty bleak prognosis about where America is already at. But he says, therefore, withdraw, right, and form, kind of microcosmic communities. You say not quite. What is the Boniface option, and how does one practice it?
Yeah, and I should say, Rod blurbed the book,
Yep.
and we corresponded about it. And I tried to be very fair to him and to the Benedict option. And I think he actually got a lot right in the Benedict option. It's not that he was wrong. It's just all of that is necessary, but not sufficient, right?
Mm.
He wrote that in 2016, 2017, I think is when it came out. And I think events have moved a lot faster than any of us really thought that they would. I mean, when you think back to 2016, 2017, it seems like a long time ago. And there's been like a shift with a lot of this stuff that we're talking about. It's just become more obvious. It's more open now. It's obviously been percolating for generations, but we're kind of coming out, like everyone kind of seems to realize that we are in a time where re-enchantment is happening for good and for ill, right? In fact, Rod has a book coming out about re-enchantment later this year. But yeah, the last chapter is basically making the case that yes, you do have to do the Benedict option. You have to, build up your church community. You do have to embed yourself in a thick local community. You do have to have your homeschools, but you're not going to be able to hunker down and like weather the storm. Like that's not that I think is a counsel of despair. I think what we need to do is do all those things that Rod talks about in the Benedict option, and then also find and fight on ground that we can win. And by that I mean, don't preserve the flame in your like private, Benedictine monastery. Carry it out into the town square and take back ground for Christ and his church where you can. So if that means moving to another part of the country or moving to a new city or moving to a smaller town so that you and like-minded people can take over the city council and take over the local school board and take over the library and have Christmas parades again. That's part of what I mean is that we have to have a outward facing Christianity that makes claims over and against the rising pagan ethos that's out there.
Oh my gosh, you're that dangerous Christian domestic extremist I keep hearing about, colonizing
right.
the school boards. I mean, they're going to shut this podcast down instantly when they hear about this.
Right.
Right. No. Okay. So this is I think very much in line with my thinking on this as well, and makes me feel even better about endorsing the book Pagan America, The Decline of Christianity and the Dark Age to Come. John, it's really great to talk to you. Just tell listeners as we close where they can find you if they want to learn more about your stuff.
Most of my writing appears at the Federalist, thefederalist.com, where I'm a senior editor, and then I infrequently and badly tweet at John D. Davidson.
we all tweet for our sins, I think.
That's right. That's right.
It's penitence. All right. Thanks, John. Talk to you soon.
Thanks, Spencer. I appreciate it.